Utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethical theory that suggests that the best action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or utility. This philosophy posits that the morality of an action is determined by its outcomes, specifically in terms of pleasure and pain it produces. Before we dive deep into it, let's find out the history and the foundation of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham is often considered as the founder of modern utilitarianism. Bentham proposed a systematic approach to ethics based on the greatest happiness principle. He believed that the actions should be judged by their ability to produce pleasure and reduce pain. Bentham introduced the idea of hedonic calculus. Hidonic calculus is a method for determining the net happiness or utility produced by an action based on how much pleasure and pain it generates. Bentham's goal was to create a scientific, systematic approach to evaluate which actions would lead to the greatest overall happiness. Hidonic calculus involves considering 7 variables that can help assess the amount of pleasure and pain an action might produce. These factors allow for the comparison of different pleasures and pains in terms of their intensity, duration, and other aspects. The first variable is intensity. How strong or intense is the pleasure or pain? A stronger pleasure or less intense pain is more valuable than the weaker one. The second one is duration. How long will the pleasure or pain last? A longer lasting pleasure is typically preferable to a shorter one, all else being equal. The third one is certainty. How certain is that the pleasure or pain will occur? If an action is likely to result in pleasure, it is considered more valuable than an action with uncertain outcomes. The fourth one is propinquity or remoteness. How soon will the pleasure or pain occur? Immediate pleasures are typically more significant than those that will come in the distant future. However, long-term consequences can also be important, and utilitarians would often factors in future benefit as well. The fifth one is called fecundity. What is the probability that the pleasure will lead to more pleasure or the pain to the more pain? A pleasurable action that leads to further pleasures is seen as more valuable. The next one is purity. How likely is the pleasure to be followed by the pain? A pure pleasure is the one that is unlikely to be followed by pain, while pure pain is one that will not be followed by pleasure. The more pure the pleasure, the more desirable it is. And the seventh and the last one is extent. How many people will be affected by the pleasure or pain? The more individuals who experience pleasure, the greater the overall value or disvalue. This aligns with the idea that the utilitarianism aims to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. This method is intended to provide a quantitative measurement of the pleasures and pain resulting from an action. If we are deciding whether a particular action is morally right, we would weigh all the positive and the negative outcomes based on the 7 factors listed above. After evaluating each factor, we could tally the overall utility or happiness that the action would produce and compare it to the other possible actions. The action that generates the most overall happiness would be considered the most ethical. For example, if you're deciding whether to donate money to charity, you might calculate the intensity of your happiness your donation would create for those in need, the duration of their happiness. Will it help them in the long term or only briefly? Also, the certainty of the donation making a difference. Is the certainty trustworthy or not? The remoteness of the action's result. Will the people helped experience a long-term lasting change, or will they face short-term relief? The fecundity. Will this act of charity lead to the further good outcomes like more donations or more help for others? The purity. Is there any potential harm or negative consequences that could follow your donation? The extent. How many people will benefit from your donation? You would then compare the total happiness or utility generated by your donation to the total happiness generated by other actions you could take. The action that maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering would be considered the right one. While the hedonic calculus is an interesting attempt to measure and quantify moral decisions, it has several limitations. The calculation is based on subjective judgments about the intensity, duration, and other aspects of pleasure and pain. Different people may value these factors differently, making the calculus unreliable or inconsistent. It is extremely difficult, if not possible, to accurately quantify all of the factors involved. How can we measure the intensity of pleasure or the extent to which a pleasure will lead to further pleasures? In practice, using the hedonic calculus for every decision would be cumbersome and impractical. Moral decisions often need to be made quickly and intuitively, without the luxury of a detailed calculation. Human happiness and the sufferings are the complex and involve more than just pleasure and pain. The hedonic calculus may oversimplify the nuanced nature of human well-being by reducing it to mere quantities of pleasure and pain. Another prominent philosopher and social reformer, John Stuart Mill, expanded upon Bentham's ideas and addressed some criticism of utilitarianism. While Bentham's version of the greatest happiness principle focused more on quantity of pleasure, Mill expanded on this by introducing the idea that not all the pleasures are equal. Higher intellectual or moral pleasures like the pursuit of knowledge or personal growth are more valuable than simple bodily pleasures like eating or drinking. Mill argued that not all the pleasures are equal. This distinction aimed to refine utilitarianism by incorporating a more nuanced understanding of happiness. In his book Utilitarianism, he defended the theory against various criticisms, articulating the moral basis for utilitarian thought and advocating for social reforms based on utilitarian principles. A society that promotes overall happiness will necessarily protect individual rights, because individuals will have a better quality of life when they are free to pursue their own happiness within reasonable limits. In other words, the rights of individuals are essential for the greatest overall happiness. There are four basic principles of utilitarianism. The first one is greatest happiness principle. The central tenet of utilitarianism is that actions are right if they promote happiness and wrong if they produce the opposite. The goal is to achieve the greatest good for the greater number of people. The second one is consequentialist. Utilitarianism focuses solely on the outcomes of actions. It evaluates actions based on their consequences rather than the intentions behind them or any intrinsic qualities. Utility. The third one is utility. Utility refers to the overall well-being, often measured in the terms of pleasure and pain. This encompasses various forms of happiness, including physical, emotional, and social well-being. The fourth one is impartiality. Utilitarianism requires that everyone's happiness counts equally. When making decisions, one should consider the welfare of all affected individuals without giving undue preferences to oneself or specific groups. There are two categories of utilitarianism. The first one is act utilitarianism. This form assesses each individual action based on its ability to produce the greatest happiness. It considers the specific context and outcomes of each situation. The second one is rule utilitarianism. Instead of evaluating individual actions, rule utilitarianism focuses on the consequences of following general rules. An action is deemed right if it adheres to a rule that, if followed consistently, would lead to the greatest overall happiness. A number of scholars and philosophers have been criticizing utilitarianism. The common criticism includes measurement challenges. The critics argue that it is difficult to accurately measure and compare happiness or utility across different individuals and situations. Utilitarianism has been criticized for potentially justifying actions that violate individual rights or principles of justice if those actions lead to the greater overall happiness. For example, it could theoretically endorse sacrificing one person to save many others. Also, the focus on immediate outcomes may overlook long-term effects, leading to the decisions that are not sustainable or beneficial in the long run. Utilitarianism is often applied in various fields, including public policy, ethics in the medicine, and the business ethics. Policymakers may use utilitarian principles to evaluate the potential impacts of law and regulations on societal well-being. Healthcare decisions, such as resources allocation, can be guided by utilitarian considerations to maximize patient outcomes. Companies may assess the broader impacts of their practices on stakeholders and society to align with the utilitarian principles. Contemporary philosophers have engaged with utilitarianism in a variety of ways, offering both support and criticism of the theory. Many contemporary philosophers, however, have criticized utilitarianism both in its classical form and in its modern adaptations. These critiques often focus on the moral intuitions, practical challenges, and ethical implications that utilitarianism seems to overlook. One of the most persistent criticism of utilitarianism is that it can justify actions that violate fundamental rights or justice if such actions result in greater overall happiness. John Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, famously criticized utilitarianism for being too demanding and impersonal. Rawls argues that utilitarianism can allow for the sacrifice of the rights of a few individuals for a greater good of the majority. His theory of justice is based on a social contract approach that emphasizes fairness and the difference principle, which argues that the social and economic inequalities should only be allowed if they benefit the least advantaged member of the society. Rawls' work represents a rejection of utilitarianism's willingness to prioritize overall utility over individual rights and fairness. Amartya Sen also critiqued utilitarianism, particularly in its classical form, for failing to adequately address issues of justice, equality, and human dignity. In his book, The Idea of Justice, Sen argues that the utilitarianism does not account for the distribution of happiness or suffering, which can lead to situations where extreme inequalities in well-being are overlooked as long as the total happiness is maximized. The significant criticism of utilitarianism comes from the repugnant conclusions, a paradox identified by the philosopher Derek Parfit in his work Reasons and Persons. This is a problem that arises when utilitarianism's focus on maximizing happiness leads to counterintuitive or morally troubling conclusions. The repugnant conclusion suggests that according to utilitarian principles, a very large population with only a small amount of happiness could be considered morally preferable to a smaller population with much greater individual happiness. This seems deeply counterintuitive because many people would prefer a smaller, happier society to a larger one with less individuals' well-being. Critics argue that this conclusion reveals a flaw in the utilitarian approach that values total happiness without considering how it is distributed. Critics also point out that utilitarianism is excessively demanding. It can require individuals to make significant personal sacrifices for the sake of maximizing overall happiness, even if when these sacrifices involve personal happiness, time, or resources. Many contemporary philosophers, however, have criticized utilitarianism both in its classical form and in its modern adaptations. These critiques often focus on the moral intuitions, practical challenges, and ethical implications that utilitarianism seems to overlook. One of the most persistent criticisms of utilitarianism is that it can justify actions that violate fundamental rights or justice if such actions result in the greater overall happiness. Bernard Williams, in his essay Critique of Utilitarianism, argues that the utilitarianism demands too much from individuals, requiring them to be constantly calculating the best outcome in every situation and possible sacrificing their own personal values and commitments in the process. He famously described this as leading to a kind of alienation where individuals lose their sense of self and personal integrity in the both pursuit of maximizing utility and pleasure. Robert Nozick, in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, argued that the utilitarianism ignores the individual's right and autonomy, reducing people to mere utility units whose interests can be sacrificed for the greater good. Nozick's entitlement theory of justice emphasizes the importance of the personal rights and property in contrast to the utilitarian focus on maximizing total happiness. John Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, famously criticized utilitarianism for being too demanding and impersonal. Rawls argued that utilitarianism can allow for the sacrifice of the rights of a few individuals for the greater good of the majority. His theory of justice is based on the social contract approach that emphasizes fairness and difference principles. It argues that social and economic inequalities should only be allowed if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. Rawls' work represents a rejection of utilitarianism's willingness to prioritize overall utility over individual rights and fairness. A significant criticism of utilitarianism comes from the repugnant conclusion. This is a problem that arises when utilitarianism's focus on maximizing happiness leads to counterintuitive or morally troubling conclusions. The repugnant conclusion suggests that according to utilitarian principles, a large population with only a small amount of happiness could be considered morally preferable to a smaller population with much greater individual happiness. This seems deeply counterintuitive because many people would prefer a small, happier society to the larger one with the lesser individual well-being, as we discussed earlier in the video. Critics argue that this conclusion reveals the flaw in the utilitarian approach that values total happiness without considering how it is distributed. Utilitarianism faces challenges in dealing with the aggregation of individual happiness or suffering. Some critics argue that aggregating individual utilities can lead to troubling outcomes in certain cases. Thomas Nagel pointing out that utilitarianism is overly focused on the total sum of well-being while neglecting the distribution of that well-being. The theory, according to Nagel, doesn't sufficiently account for the significance of the individual experiences of persons within a society and may lead to situations where people are treated unfairly or harmfully as long as the overall sum of happiness is maximized. In response to these criticisms, some contemporary philosophers have worked to revise utilitarianism or adapt it to address its shortcomings. Some contemporary philosophers continue to defend utilitarianism, arguing that it offers a clear and rational framework for moral decision-making. These supporters emphasize the utilitarianism focus on maximizing well-being and providing a practical method for resolving moral dilemmas. Peter Singer, one of the most well-known contemporary utilitarians, defends a form of preference utilitarianism, which argues that we should consider the preferences of all beings capable of having preferences, not just humans. Singer stresses the importance of impartiality and equality in the moral consideration, arguing that we should act to minimize suffering and maximize well-being for all sentient beings, including animals. His work on effective altruism builds on utilitarian principles to guide people in making charitable and life choices that do the most good. Richard Layard, an economist and philosopher, has argued for utilitarian principles in political and social contexts, emphasizing the importance of happiness economics. Layard believes that the governments and the societies should aim to improve the subjective well-being of their citizens, making policies that maximize overall happiness and minimize suffering. Full utilitarianism, defended by philosophers like John Stuart Mill and more recently Brad Hooker, suggests that we should not evaluate individual actions based on their consequences, but rather follow rules that, when generally followed, lead to greatest happiness. This approach tries to avoid some of the sacrificing individual rights problems of act utilitarianism by establishing general principles that maximize utility. Negative utilitarianism focuses on minimizing suffering rather than maximizing happiness, arguing that the reduction of suffering should be the primary moral goal. Some philosophers like Karl Popper have suggested that the avoidance of harm should take priority over promoting good, because harm can have a much more profound negative impact on people than good can have positive effect. Utilitarianism remains a significant and influential ethical theory advocating for actions that promote the greatest overall happiness, while it provides a clear framework for evaluating moral decisions based on the consequences. It also faces important criticism and challenges that continue to fuel philosophical debates about ethics and morality. This video was just a brief introduction of the concept. For deeper understandings, I would suggest the works of Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and some of the contemporary philosophers. Some of the good books that can be read are An Introduction to the Principles of Moral and Legislation by Jeremy Bentham, Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, Utilitarianism for and Against by J.J.C. Smart and Bernard Williams, Rethinking the Good, Moral Ideals and the Nature of Practical Reasoning by Robert Audi.